On a Tuesday, May 7th, 1907, Seattle filmmaker William Harbeck mounted a camera on the front of a BC Electric streetcar and shot what is now the earliest known surviving footage of Vancouver. This is what his camera recorded. Many things have changed since William Harbeck shot his scenes of Vancouver 100 years ago. The population of Vancouver has grown from 70,000 to over 600,000 in an urban region of over 2.1 million. People complain of traffic congestion throughout the region. There are major construction projects going on everywhere. Whole blocks and neighborhoods seem to be changing almost overnight. Construction cranes are everywhere. 100 years ago, Vancouver was also seemingly changing overnight. Construction was everywhere. Slogans on banners over the main streets shouted out the benefits of growth and development. The city of Vancouver had been incorporated just 21 years before this film was shot. In those 21 short years, the population had shot from 1,000 to just over 70,000 people. There were plenty of stores. Businesses and banks had put up substantial multi-story stone and brick buildings. It's hard to believe that just a little over 2 decades earlier, much of this area was thick forest. Without doubt, the young city was booming. It had become the financial and transportation center of the province, quickly outdoing the older cities of New Westminster and Victoria. With its roaring economy, Vancouver was on the map. It was quickly attracting investment and also visitors from around the world. This was the city that William Harbeck had come to shoot. Harbeck had been a deputy sheriff, a steam laundry operator, and a newspaper editor before he turned to filmmaking. Here he is working for the Canadian Pacific Railway. The Toledo, Ohio-born cameraman had made a name for himself by supposedly being one of the first to film the aftermath of the San Francisco earthquake just a year earlier in 1906. Here is some footage of Market Street in that city. A year later, now based in Seattle, the 44-year-old film entrepreneur visited Vancouver to shoot film for the Selig Polyscope Company of Chicago. He took his hand-cranked camera and mounted it to the front of a streetcar put at his disposal by the BC Electric Railway Company. Filming was set to begin. The special film streetcar would start at the corner of Granville and Georgia. The car would head north on Granville. By 1907, this intersection had already become the young city's social, entertainment, and commercial hub, and the Canadian Pacific Railway had a great deal to do with it. Looking at an early map of what would become the downtown peninsula, it's easy to see why. In 1884, the CPR received a land grant including 480 acres of what would eventually become today's downtown Vancouver. This land grant was to the west of the original settlement of Granville, which had grown up along the edge of Hastings Mill. Granville would become the city of Vancouver in April 1886. When the railroad was finally finished all the way to Vancouver, the Canadian Pacific built their station well to the west of the then center of town. By quickly building a hotel just 4 blocks up the hill from their train station, the CPR hoped that businesses and other investors could be persuaded to move to the railroad's land. The CPR succeeded. Our streetcar with the camera mounted on the front is now ready to go on Granville, with Georgia just ahead of us. On the far left, only a corner of the CPR's Hotel Vancouver is seen. Built on the southwest corner of Granville and Georgia, the original Hotel Vancouver was a fairly modest affair when it first opened. It wasn't long after that the railroad soon began to enlarge the hotel. Major rebuilding and expansion continued. By the time it was all finished in 1915, the Hotel Vancouver had become a lavish grand palace.
This is the new Hotel Vancouver. While it sat unfinished for 10 years until it opened in 1939, every musician in town wondered who was going to get the gig at the Panorama Roof nightclub. I'm Dal Richards.
In the meantime, the old hotel closed. It stood empty for a long time. After World War II, soldiers and their families were housed there until 1949 when the building was finally demolished. The site then sat empty for almost 2 decades until construction began on the Toronto-Dominion Tower and the Pacific Centre Mall. Back in 1907, across the intersection from the original Hotel Vancouver, stood the Hudson's Bay Company store. One of the world's oldest enterprises, the Hudson's Bay Company has its roots in the fur trade, having received their royal charter in May 1670. By the late 19th century in the cities, the company had become more of a general merchant. The company opened its first store in Vancouver on Cordova in 1887. 3 years later, they joined the increasing number of businesses moving to Granville. They opened this large new red brick building in 1893. Just 2 decades later, business was so good that they decided to expand. The expansion went up at the corner of Seymour and Georgia, just east of their first building. When the second phase of the expansion continued in 1925, the old red brick building itself was torn down, and a new building was built on the old store's site. And this is the building that now makes up the bay as it's known in 2007. Meanwhile, back 100 years ago, newspapers had publicized the filming that was about to take place. Many residents went out to see for themselves. This is how the next day's paper described it.
Many prominent citizens were suddenly stricken with kinetoscopitis yesterday. The attacks became epidemic just after noon, but the results so far have not proved serious.
We are finally underway. The streetcar is moving, it's 12 noon. Harbeck wanted to start at this time so there would be many people on the streets. People notice the camera right away. Some just stare, but others give a friendly wave. In 2007, global warming and various kinds of pollution are big concerns. In 1907, there was a different kind of pollution on the streets.
If you had been a visitor to Vancouver in 1907, you may have stopped in at the Vancouver Tourist Association between Georgia and Dunsmuir. Mr. W.E. Flumerfeld of the association, who was riding with William Harbeck on the streetcar, probably pointed this out. That turreted structure is the impressive Bank of Montreal building at the corner of Granville and Dunsmuir. In the 1970s, it was torn down for a modern branch of the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, which itself was converted to a drugstore in 2007. I'm Chuck Davis.
We continue our journey still on Granville and approaching Dunsmuir. Could someone be watching our streetcar from one of these windows? A 1907 city directory lists one E. Carr artist as a resident at 570 Granville Street. Could a 35-year-old Emily Carr have been at the window watching our streetcar? Most of the buildings on the left side of Granville between Dunsmuir and Pender disappeared as the Pacific Centre Mall expanded in the 1980s. As you can see, bicycling is a popular way of getting around in 1907. The development of the pneumatic bicycle tire 20 years earlier makes for a much more comfortable ride. Bicycling gave everyone more freedom. They didn't have to depend on streetcar routes or schedules, and it was cheaper than a horse or car. As we get to Pender, we see the main post office in 1907. It was from this building that the first home delivery of the mail began in 1895. Just past the intersection on the right in the low buildings, an early Purdy's chocolate store would open in 1911. Richard Purdy opened his first store in 1907. The Rogers Building took up this corner by 1912.
Streetcar tracks were laid on Granville Street in 1890. The streetcar would then be the backbone of public transit in Vancouver until the late 1940s when buses started replacing them. Streetcar service ended on this section of Granville in 1955. I'm Vicki Gabbro, and I was 9.
In 1974, this section of Granville was turned into a mall to be used by pedestrians and public transit only. In 2007, Granville is torn up in sections as underground stations are being built for the new Canada Line rapid transit route to Richmond and the airport. The line will open in 2009. 100 years ago, we're about to cross Pender. Notice how traffic keeps to the left. BC is one of 3 provinces following British practice. We will change the rest of North America's standard on January 1st, 1922, but that's still almost 15 years into the future. Just ahead, on the left, at the corner of Hastings and Granville, another new building is going up. When finished, this building would become Vancouver's next main post office in 1910. It would be the main post office for 47 years until a new building is built on the corner of Georgia and Homer. After renovations, the old post office, along with 3 other adjacent buildings, now make up the Sinclair Centre, a shopping and office complex. The building dominating the view at the end of the street is the Canadian Pacific Railway's Terminal Building. It was opened in 1899. It's a beautiful-looking chateau-style building. This is the second station to serve Vancouver. It replaced this earlier station, which wasn't much more than a shelter against the elements. The second CPR station, the chateau-style building, only lasted sadly for 15 years. By 1914, a new station just to the east of it was already open, and the old station was being torn down. By the 1970s, this third station was also in danger of being demolished. Although passenger trains stopped using it in 1979, it was already on its way to becoming a new transportation center. In 1977, it became the Vancouver terminal of the new Seabus passenger ferry service running to North Vancouver. In 2007, the Seabus service averages about 17,000 passengers every weekday. In 1986, another transportation mode started using the station. The automated SkyTrain system began using the station that had now been renamed Waterfront Station. Passenger trains returned to the station when the West Coast Express commuter trains began running to Mission in 1995. The site of the old chateau-style station is now a plaza beside the Granville Square office towers of the Vancouver Sun and Province newspapers.
In 1907, we're nearing the corner of Granville and Hastings with its landmark clock. This northeast corner was known as Trory's Corner because of the well-known jeweler's big sidewalk clock. Montreal-based Henry Burks & Sons came to Vancouver in February of 1907 and bought George Trory's shop. They kept him on as manager, and they also kept his famous sidewalk clock. When Burks' new building and store opened in 1912 at Granville in Georgia, the clock was also moved, and everyone knew what "meet me at the clock" meant. The old Burks building was torn down in 1974. By 1994, Burks was back at Granville and Hastings, but this time on the southeast corner, in what had been built as a Canadian Bank of Commerce in 1908. The clock will be put back on that corner when Canada Line construction is finished.
The large sheds seen at various times in the street are storage sheds for construction projects that are going on. And there seem to be construction projects going on in every block of Vancouver in 1907. We make our big sweeping turn, turning east onto Hastings Street. The carriage crossing the street ahead of us is on Seymour. On the left, on the northeast corner of Seymour and Hastings, is the Molson's Bank. Founded by the Montreal brewing family, its assets were bought by the Bank of Montreal in the 1920s.
Just beyond the bank is the light-colored building of the Victoria-based Spencer's department store. In fact, my mum worked there in the China department. David Spencer had put his 38-year-old son Chris in charge of the Vancouver store. Still further east, beyond Spencer's, is the Bank of British North America at the corner of Richards. Founded in 1835 in London, England, the bank had offices in several Canadian cities, including Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. The Bank of British North America was taken over by the Bank of Montreal in 1918. The building itself was torn down in the early 20s to make way for a new Spencer's building in 1923, as the ever-expanding store eventually took up most of the block. Spencer's was bought by the Toronto-based T. Eaton Company department store in the 40s. They eventually moved their store up to Granville and Robson. And the old Spencer building, after renovations, became the downtown satellite campus of Simon Fraser University in 1989.
On the right, on the southeast corner of Richards and Hastings, is the one-time Bank of British Columbia, which merged with the Canadian Bank of Commerce in 1901. The building was later occupied by the Pittman Business College, before the college moved to another location. The building is still there 100 years later. The Waves Coffee Shop is now on the ground floor.
We are approaching Richard Street. Farther along on the left are the Fit-Right store and E.A. Morris, the tobacconist. Although there have been exterior changes, most of these buildings on the left or north side of Hastings between Richards and Homer are still there 100 years later. This is Grace McCarthy, reflecting on 100 years of history.
Watch the little boy on the left. His mother just pulls him out of the way of the streetcar. He's in his little Lord Fauntleroy outfit. The suit had been a fad since 1885. On the right, at the end of the block, at the corner of Homer, is a branch of the Royal Bank of Canada. 100 years later, the building really doesn't look much different. There's no banking there, however. Today, it's the film production campus of the Vancouver Film School. In the downtown area of Vancouver 100 years ago, most of the faces are white, and the city has a very British feel. 100 years later, immigration has changed the face of Vancouver. Large group of Asian and South Asian immigrants, especially in the 1990s, have made the city a far more cosmopolitan place. As we approach Hamilton, just above and to the left of the horse-drawn wagon is the Arcade building. It's a single-story shopping emporium. It would be demolished later in the year to be replaced with the wonderful Beaux-Arts Dominion Trust building. You can just see the girders in the back. Opened in 1910, this cloud scraper, as it was called, became an instant landmark and a popular postcard subject. It was for a brief time the tallest building in the British Empire. On the far side of Cambie is the Flak Block. Built with proceeds from the Klondike, the Flak Block has been designed in the Romanesque style, which was popularized in Chicago. A renovation in the 1940s removed much of the building's architectural details, but a restoration underway in 2007 will return the building close to its 1898 look. What looks to be an empty area ahead on the right is the future Victory Square. In 1907, it's still known as Government Square, part of the grounds of the courthouse, which is just out of view. We'll get another view of the square when our streetcar returns. Cambie was the boundary between the old town of Granville and the CPR property to the west. It's where the two street surveys met, which is why Hastings changes course here. Watch the young lads running across the street in front of us. Perhaps they're on their lunch break from the nearby Central School just up the block on Pender. In 1907, this was the newspaper district. You can see the Daily Province's office ahead on the right. The News Advertiser was just around the block, and the Vancouver World and Sun would also soon be in the neighborhood. Oh, the lads have managed to hitch a ride on the passing wagon. All except the slow one in the group, and you'll try again some other day. Sitting on the right side of Hastings, near Abbott, is the only car seen in this film. In 1907, there were only 175 cars registered in the whole province. Just 10 years later, there were over 11,000. In 1907, Vancouver's fire chief was teased for wanting to buy motorized fire trucks, but he ordered 3. The police department got their first car in September.
Hi, I'm Dave McCormick. In 1907, motoring was really starting to take off in Vancouver, and Canada's first gas station opened at Smythe and Cambie. Increasing traffic soon meant that police officers had to be assigned to major intersections to control the traffic. And by the late 1920s, many officers at intersections were using a type of traffic semaphore, which they would turn to show stop or go.
According to City of Vancouver sources, the first automated traffic lights went into service in 1930. About a dozen went into operation on January 23rd north of Georgia between Granville and Maine. Today, 765 intersections and crossings are controlled by traffic lights, and there are now almost 1.4 million vehicles in Metro Vancouver alone. Back in 1907, across the street from the parked car is Woodward's, the local department store at Abbott and Hastings. It has just been 4 years since Charles Woodward opened his new store here. From a small 3-story brick and timber building, his store would expand in a haphazard way to eventually take over almost the entire block. Unfortunately, the enterprise went out of business just after celebrating its 100th birthday in 1992. In 2007, all that survives is the original 1903-1908 building seen here from Cordova, The rest of the site is being redeveloped into a mix of housing and educational uses. In 1907, this section of Hastings was an important business street. By 2007, the larger neighborhood is known as the downtown East Side, and it has its share of social problems, from inadequate housing, poverty, and a visible drug problem. In 1907, Hastings between Abbott and Carroll is a busy section of the street. The construction shed on the left, just ahead, is in front of Fred Buscom's new store. Buscom's was a popular glass and china store. Frederick Buscom was Vancouver's 11th mayor. The building that housed Buscom survives in 2007 as the tallest part of the Army and Navy store complex on this part of Hastings. We continue our trip down Hastings. There's the construction shack on the left in front of Buscom's. And we're getting closer to Carroll. We'll let this wagon get out of our way here.
Those crossing gates guarded the CPR tracks that ran between the harbor and the railway's yards on the north side of Falls Creek. The number of trains increased, and this would often tie up traffic on 5 busy downtown streets simultaneously. The city demanded a solution. In 1931, the railway started building a tunnel from west of their Cordova Street station to their Falls Creek yards. This became known as the Dunsmuir Tunnel because it ran mostly under that street. Trains used the tunnel for more than 50 years until 1982. After moving the east portal and extensive rebuilding, the tunnel found a new use in 1986 as part of the SkyTrain's route under downtown. Meanwhile, back at Hastings and Carroll, the old railway right-of-way has been preserved as part of a future greenway.
In 1907, Carroll and Hastings was a busy corner. The BC Electric Railway Company opened their terminal here in the 1890s on the southwest corner. It's the low 2-story building on the far right. The company's interurban cars left from here for New Westminster and eventually to Langley and Chilliwack. These cars looked like streetcars, but they were larger, faster, and more comfortable for the longer trips. 5 years after our streetcar passed this way, BC Electric replaced their small building with a new head office and terminal in 1912. The building still stands today. A bank branch used to occupy the space formerly used by the interurbans. Various companies now have offices in the building. On the right, on the far side of Carroll, with what looks like a witch's hat on top, is the Woods Hotel. The Woods on the southeast corner of Carroll and Hastings welcome travelers to the city with a choice of European or American plans. In 2007, the old Woods Hotel building is undergoing extensive renovations, and they're even going to put the witch's hat turret back on top. As we get closer to the railway crossing gates and Carroll Street, we can see a large advertising sign painted on the side of the building straight ahead of us in the curve. It advertises one of the oldest pharmacies in Vancouver, Knowlton Drugs. Knowlton Drugs is seen on the left corner of Carroll and Hastings. 100 years later, Knowlton Drugs is still there. They're almost in the same location, although now just a few doors around the corner on Hastings. We continue our journey. We're almost over the tracks at Carroll Street. Nearby Chinatown is now a growing and prominent part of Vancouver. The anti-Asian riots of 1907 took place near here. On September the 7th, after speeches and a rally, an excited crowd of men marched to attack Chinatown and then the Japanese community, resulting in some broken windows.
The Dome Tower in the upper left is part of the Carnegie Library on what is today Main Street. The library, the city's first, was built in 1903, funded by Andrew Carnegie, a U.S. steel magnate and philanthropist. Carnegie funded over 2,500 libraries around the world. It remained the city's main branch until the opening of the new building at Robson and Burrard in 1957, and replaced in 1996 with Morsha Safdie's spectacular new building at Robson and Homer. In the meantime, back on Main Street, the old Carnegie building serves the downtown east side as a community center, the city's busiest.
Although our streetcar continues east on Hastings, the film cuts before we can see the newly completed Pantages Theatre on the right side of Hastings. At this point, the filming ends.
While new rolls of film were being placed in the camera, the car returned by way of Powell Street, and more pictures of Carroll, Cordova, and Cambie Streets were taken. Daily Province, May 8, 1907.
Our journey picks up again on Carroll. We're looking towards Hastings and Falls Creek. Just visible at the end of the street is the Royal City Planing Mill. The mill would burn down the following year. The Rainier Hotel is on the right side of Carroll at the corner of Cordova. Built in the year this film was shot, the Rainier replaced an earlier wooden building that was used as a gambling resort during the Klondike Gold Rush. We're rolling, and we make our turn westbound onto Cordova Street. Cordova was the main street of the young city before the businesses started moving further west and closer to the new center of the city near Granville. Cordova was the street where important parades and celebrations were traditionally held. It was also part of the route of the city's first streetcar line, which opened in 1890. The architecture on the street also reflects its importance. The prominent building on the left is the Dunsmuir Block of 1889, an impressive example of the Italianate style. It was the home to many fraternal organizations and also where the small Jewish population met before they constructed their own synagogue in 1911. The Dunsmuir building remains very much a part of the fabric of Cordova Street in 2007. Notice the sign on the left for P. Burns & Company. P. Burns & Company was a butcher company. They are one of several businesses on this street using electric light bulbs on their signs. Today, this part of Cordova is one way, and we would be going against the traffic. We are slowly making our way to Abbott Street. Abbott Street is where the two kids are running across the street. The Hotel Metropole sign advertises the hotel on the left side of the street, right at the corner.
The Edison Grand Theater is a little building on the right. A very young Al Jolson had played the theater in the previous year. The adjacent larger building is the Savoy Hotel. In this earlier photograph of the hotel and the theater has yet to be renamed.
Across the street, the building with the twin-peaked roof used to house the first Hudson's Bay store in Vancouver before it moved to Granville. Where the Savoy Hotel in Edison Grand used to be, the Woodward's Parkade was built in the 1940s, at the time called the largest in the British Commonwealth. Across the street, Woodward's had expanded from Hastings to Cordova. In 2007, very little is left. The Woodward's expansions have been demolished and new development is taking place. As we continue further west on Cordova, we get a better look at the building with the twin-peaked roof where the Hudson's Bay was. Just beyond, on the same side of the street, a large sign advertises James Dixon Williams' amusement parlor, The Exhibit. The exhibit included a Hale's Scenes of the World facility, advertised as the Pullman Flyer. The idea, according to newspapers of the day,
was to give the illusion of a railway journey. The room in which the cinematography works is fitted up like a railway car, noise, rocking, and all. And as the panorama unfolded, the passing scenes are explained to the audience.
This is the type of facility where our streetcar film would have been shown. James Stark's Glasgow House dry goods store is on the left at the corner of Cambie. Later, the building would be the Carlton, and then the Cambie Hotel in 2007. As we get closer to Cambie, just take a look at the signs. There's a payroll company, and then there's a painted sign on the building just above it, advertising Cascade Beer, the beer without a peer. The two-story building directly ahead of us no longer exists in 2007. Now we make our turn up Cambie as we head towards Hastings. The Dominion Trust building would be built in another few years behind the passing streetcar. We can just see a corner of the old courthouse on Government Square on the right. This building served as the provincial courthouse until being replaced by a newer courthouse on Georgia Street. The Georgia Courthouse became the home of the Vancouver Art Gallery in 1983. Back on Government Square, the old courthouse at Cambie and Hastings was demolished in 1912. The site sat empty for a few years before being used as a tabernacle and then a recruiting station during World War I. In the 1920s, the Southam family of newspaper fame donated money to landscape the site. A cenotaph was built to honor the war dead, and the park was renamed Victory Square. On the left side of Cambie, across the street on Hastings, is the Herman House Real Estate Company. They probably knew about the many real estate deals in the city, like a well-designed 3-bedroom cottage for $5,000, or Kitsilano and Fairview lots for $2,800. A house in those neighborhoods today might be worth well over $1 million. Just beyond the real estate company, the small white building is the office of the Vancouver News Advertiser. In 1912, the paper was bought by Robert Cromie, who then also owned the Vancouver Sun. Again, the film has changed. It's hard to believe this quiet tree-lined scene will become the very busy Robson Street of 2007. We've just crossed Burrard, we're heading west towards Stanley Park. In 1907, Vancouver's business section was really quite small. Much of the peninsula would develop as a residential district known as the West End. Robson, like other streets in the West End, was popular with homeowners, and many fine houses were built in the neighborhood. Streetcars came to Robson in 1895, and they really changed the street and the neighborhood. A hint of the future can be seen to the right just above the trees. The Manhattan Apartments are under construction in 1907. It was one of the earliest multiple-family dwellings in the West End. It was almost torn down in the 1970s, but was saved and even refurbished. Today, they are still very much a part of Robson. With the coming of the Manhattan, other changes were coming too. By the beginning of the First World War in 1914, residential Robson was quickly starting to become more and more a commercial street. In the 1950s, post-war immigration saw a number of European delis and restaurants open on the street, enough that Robson Street was soon nicknamed Robsonstrasse. Robson's character again started changing in the 1980s. From a homey neighborhood shopping street, Robson has turned into a busy high-end shopping district featuring the flagship stores of internationally known brand names. Parts of the West End, including Robson, were enjoying newly laid concrete sidewalks. Wooden planks at the intersections protected the ladies' long skirts from the mud of the unpaved street. Horse-drawn delivery wagons still stir up the dust, and you can see them just ahead on the right. Horse-drawn deliveries would continue into the 1950s in Vancouver. None of the original houses remain on the street. The last one was torn down in the 1980s. Away from Robson, the West End today is still a residential neighborhood. An eclectic mix of houses, small apartments, and towers are home to almost 45,000 people. Harbeck's film continues until Nicola. Because the only copy of his film is incomplete, we miss the rest of Robson and Denman.
We are now on Davie at Bidwell, looking east up the hill. On the left is Gabriola, the home of sugar magnate Benjamin Tingley Rogers. Completed in 1901, the mansion is named for the Gulf island from which the exterior stone was quarried. B.T. Rogers was 24 when he moved to Vancouver in 1889. He opened BC Sugar Refinery with $80,000 in loans. The small sugar refinery was the first industry in British Columbia not related to timber or fisheries. Gabriola was sold just 18 years later in 1925 and subdivided into apartments. Since 1975, it has been the home to several restaurants.
We continue our journey heading up the hill eastbound on Davie. The prominent home with the corner turret and wraparound porch at Nicola and Davy belongs to Robert Kelly, one of the founding partners in the wholesale company of Kelly Douglas. The company is perhaps best known for their Nabob coffee brand, introduced in 1896. There were many impressive homes on the slope south of Davy with its views over English Bay. It was a popular area with prominent people such as the Bell Irvings, lumberman John Hendry, and William Salisbury, the CPR treasurer. On much of Davy, the house building was more speculative, with home builders hoping to capitalize on the grand homes nearby. Years earlier, in 1862, this entire area was part of a 540-acre lot that was sold for all of $550.75 to John Morton, Samuel Brighouse, and William Hailstone. Although they eventually tried to develop it, the real development only started after the streetcar lines on Robson, Denman, and Davy were built in 1895 and 1900. At the crest of the hill, 3 of the homes at the corner of Jervis are still standing in 2007. After 1907, storefronts started being added to the homes on Davy, filling in the front yard. As the years passed, many of the buildings would be torn down for larger commercial buildings. The streetcar, which came to Davy in 1900, was gone by 1948. All streetcar service in the city ended in April 1955, with the last run on Hastings Street to Kootenay Loop. For many of the people in this neighborhood, excursions to the beach on English Bay behind us were very popular, especially after sand was added to the shore in the last years of the 1800s. Our film continues until Bute Street. Our streetcar would continue on to Granville, although there's no film of that. The changes on these streets over a span of 100 years are remarkable. Sometimes it's almost impossible to even tell where we are in the city when we watch the 1907 film. Maybe it would be easier if we saw both films 100 years apart. While the scenes from 2007 may seem very ordinary to us today, they won't be in a few years. Some of the buildings will be torn down. New ones will go up. Fashions will change. Hairstyles will change. Perhaps even modes of transportation will change. Think of it 10, 25, 50, or even 100 years from now. These scenes from 2007 will be as fascinating to future viewers as William Harbeck's 1907 footage is to us. As such, we invite some future viewer to record these scenes again 100 years later in 2107.